The train from Lyon arrived 40 minutes late on a morning when the frost still clung to the station platform. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier watched it through the window of a café across the street, her coffee untouched and cold. She had been waiting since dawn. The delay meant nothing. Trains ran late under occupation, their schedules bent to the will of German military transport, but every additional minute was a minute when something could go wrong. When the uniformed men could ask questions. When a passenger might be pulled aside, a bag searched, a false identity discovered in the fumbling of nervous hands. She was 23 years old. She had been a photojournalist before the war, capturing the faces of miners in the north, children in the streets of Paris, the kind of work that made you believe in the dignity of ordinary life. Now she carried messages folded inside the spine of a book, her camera replaced by coded instructions that could send men to blow up railway lines or guide Allied pilots to safe houses in the countryside. The transformation had not been dramatic. There had been no single moment of decision. The war had simply arrived, like weather, and she had responded to it the way one responds to winter, by finding warmth where you could, by protecting what mattered, by surviving. The occupation of France had begun in the summer of 1940, when the German army swept across the border with a speed that shattered every assumption about modern warfare. The government fled. The armistice was signed. The country was divided into zones, the north and west under direct German military administration, the south under the collaborationist Vichy regime that pretended to sovereignty while doing Berlin's bidding. Marshal Pétain, the aged hero of Verdun, spoke on the radio about honor and sacrifice and the need to cooperate with the occupiers. His voice was grandfatherly, reassuring, and it disgusted Marie-Claude in ways she could not fully articulate. To cooperate with fascism was not honor. It was erasure. In those early months, resistance was scattered and improvised. Men and women who had fought in Spain against Franco, communists who saw Hitler as the ultimate enemy, monarchists who believed in the soul of France, Catholics who could not reconcile their faith with tyranny, they all began, independently and without coordination, to resist. They printed underground newspapers on hand-cranked presses hidden in basements. They sheltered British soldiers cut off from Dunkirk. They gathered intelligence about German troop movements and whispered it to contacts who might, somehow, get the information to London. It was chaotic and brave and often suicidal. Women were there from the beginning, though the historical record would later struggle to remember them. They were there because they had to be. Because their husbands had been taken prisoner or killed. Because their sons were being conscripted for forced labor in German factories. Because fascism was not an abstraction but a reality that entered your home, rationed your food, restricted your movement, and demanded your complicity. To do nothing was to participate. To resist was to remain human. Marie-Claude saw the woman step off the train before she fully recognized her. It was the way she moved, purposeful but not hurried, her coat buttoned against the cold, her hat pulled low enough to shadow her face without seeming deliberately hidden. Hélène Vianney. They had met only twice before, both times in circumstances where conversation had been impossible. Hélène was part of a network that published Defense de la France, one of the most widely circulated underground newspapers in the occupied zone. She was also, though few knew it, helping to forge identity papers for Jews fleeing the increasingly brutal roundups that had begun that summer. Marie-Claude left a few coins on the table and walked out into the cold morning. The street was quiet. A German patrol passed, two soldiers smoking and talking, their breath visible in the air. She waited until they turned the corner. Then she crossed the street and fell into step beside Hélène as though they were old friends who had arranged to walk together. "Your train was late," Marie-Claude said quietly. "They held us outside Dijon for an hour. A transport convoy had priority." "Did anyone check papers?" A German officer walked through twice. He looked tired. He barely glanced at mine. They walked in silence for a block. The city around them was a study in contradiction. Paris under occupation was still beautiful. The architecture had not changed. The Seine still wound through its heart. The cafes still served coffee, though it tasted of burnt acorns and chicory. But there were swastika flags hanging from the grand buildings now. German soldiers filled the boulevards. There were curfews and checkpoints and the ever-present sense that you were being watched. The Gestapo had taken over buildings on the Avenue Fourche. People disappeared into those buildings and sometimes did not come out. "I have the photographs," Hélène said. She did not specify what photographs, and Marie-Claude did not ask. Compartmentalization was survival. If you were arrested and interrogated, you could not reveal what you did not know. They need to reach London within the week. "I'll pass them tonight," Marie-Claude said. "Germaine is handling the next leg." Germaine Talion was an anthropologist who had turned her meticulous scholar's mind toward resistance. She documented everything, every agent arrested, every safe house compromised, every act of German reprisal against civilians. She believed that the truth would matter after the war, that someone would need to bear witness to what had happened. Marie-Claude admired her for this faith in the future, though she herself found it hard to think beyond the next day, the next message, the next narrow escape. They reached a corner where their paths would diverge. Hélène paused, adjusting her gloves. "Be careful," she said. "They arrested 3 people in our network last week. The Gestapo is getting better at finding us." Marie-Claude nodded. There was nothing else to say. They parted without further words, 2 women who might have been discussing the weather or the price of bread, and the city swallowed them back into its routines. The danger was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of daily life. You learn to live with it the way you learn to live with hunger, with cold, with the absence of people you loved. It shaped you. It taught you to read faces, to notice who was watching, to memorize escape routes from every room you entered. It taught you to lie so smoothly that the lies felt like truth. And it taught you that courage was not the absence of fear but the ability to function while terrified. Women made exceptional couriers because they were underestimated. German soldiers and Gestapo agents were trained to look for male saboteurs, for communist organizers, for armed partisans. They were not trained to suspect young women traveling with shopping bags, or middle-aged women who looked like schoolteachers, or grandmothers knitting on trains. The patriarchy of the enemy became a weapon against them. Women could move through checkpoints with forged documents and coded messages hidden in their clothes, in hollowed-out loaves of bread, in the linings of suitcases. They could smile at soldiers and answer questions in accented German and be waved through because they seemed harmless. Feminine invisibility, which had oppressed women for centuries, became a tool of survival and subversion. Andrée de Jongh understood this better than most. She was a nurse from Brussels, barely 25 years old, with dark hair and a quiet intensity that made people trust her. In 1941, she had walked into the British consulate in Bilbao, Spain, and informed the startled officials that she had just escorted 3 British pilots across occupied France, over the Pyrenees, and into neutral territory. She was prepared to do it again. And again. As many times as necessary. They did not believe her at first. She was too young, too slight, too much a woman to have accomplished what she claimed. But the pilots confirmed her story, and the British realized they had found something extraordinary. Andrée became the backbone of what would be known as the Comet Line, an escape network that would eventually guide more than 800 Allied airmen out of occupied Europe. She organized the safe houses, bribed the border guards, walked the mountain passes in winter with men who could barely keep pace with her. She was arrested multiple times and talked her way out with forged papers and flawless composure. Her code name was Dede, and by 1943, the Gestapo had a price on her head, though they did not yet know her real name. The Pyrenees were brutal in winter. The snow could come suddenly, erasing the trails, turning the mountains into a maze of white where you could freeze to death within hours of losing your way. Andrée had made the crossing more than 30 times. She knew which paths the German patrols avoided, which Spanish border guards could be bought, which farmhouses along the route would shelter fugitives without asking questions. She traveled light, a small rucksack with food, a change of clothes, a pistol she had never fired but carried for the comfort of its weight. The men she guided were often larger and stronger than she was, but they followed her without question because she radiated competence. In the mountains, there was no room for doubt. One night in January 1943, she led 4 American airmen up a ridge where the wind cut like razors and the snow was knee-deep. They had been walking for 6 hours. One of the men, a bombardier from Ohio named James, was struggling. His boots were inadequate, and his feet were beginning to freeze. He kept stopping, leaning against trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Keep moving," Andrée told him in her careful English. "If you stop, you die. It's that simple." "I can't," he said. "I need to rest." She stepped close to him, her face inches from his. "You will rest in Spain. Not here. Do you understand me?" There was steel in her voice, and he nodded, too exhausted to argue. She took his arm and half-dragged him forward. The others helped. They reached the Spanish border just before dawn, and the men collapsed in a barn while Andrée negotiated with a local guide to take them the rest of the way to Bilbao. She never saw them again. That was the nature of the work. You saved people and then they vanished into the machinery of war, and you returned to occupied territory to do it again. Back in France, the networks were multiplying. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, had begun parachuting agents into the countryside to organize sabotage and coordinate resistance. Many of these agents were women. The SOE had discovered what the resistance already knew. Women could operate with less suspicion, could blend into civilian life more easily, could take enormous risks because no one expected them to. They were trained in Scotland, in manor houses converted into clandestine schools where they learned to fire weapons, set explosives, encode messages, withstand interrogation. Then they were dropped into the darkness over France with false identities and a few francs and instructions to build networks, to recruit fighters, to disrupt the German war machine any way they could. Lise de Baissac was one of the first. She was a Mauritian woman who spoke perfect French and had a gift for organization that was almost architectural in its precision. She parachuted into France in September 1942 and established herself in Poitiers as an artist, living quietly and painting watercolors while building a network of saboteurs who would eventually derail trains, destroy munitions depots, and gather intelligence on German troop strengths. Her brother Claude was also an SOE agent, but they operated separately, their paths crossing only rarely. To work alone was safer. If one was arrested, the other might survive. She rented a small apartment near the center of town, furnished it modestly, and introduced herself to the neighbors as a widow whose husband had died in the early fighting. The neighbors were sympathetic and asked few questions. She spent her days painting and her nights receiving parachute drops in fields outside the city, organizing the weapons and explosives that arrived in metal canisters, distributing them to local resistance groups. She wore wool dresses and carried a purse and smiled at German officers on the street, and none of them ever suspected that the gracious, soft-spoken woman walking past them had spent the previous night showing farmers how to use plastic explosives to destroy railway bridges. The radio operators were perhaps the most vulnerable. They had to transmit messages back to London, and every transmission was a risk. The Germans had direction-finding equipment, trucks equipped with antennas that could triangulate a radio signal within minutes. The protocol was to transmit for no more than 20 minutes before moving to a new location. Even then, the operators lived with the knowledge that every message they sent might be their last, that the Gestapo might be closing in even as they tapped out coded letters on their wireless sets. Noor Inayat Khan was a radio operator who had grown up between worlds. Her father was an Indian Sufi Myzik, her mother was American, and she had been raised in Paris and London, speaking multiple languages, absorbing the literature and music and spirituality of 3 continents. She wrote children's books before the war. She played the harp. She was gentle and reflective in a way that seemed utterly incompatible with espionage. Her SOE instructors had doubts about her suitability for fieldwork. She was too emotional, too honest, too incapable of the necessary ruthlessness. But she was also fluent in French, and she was determined, and there was a desperate shortage of radio operators. In June 1943, she was parachuted into France with the code name Madeleine. She arrived during one of the most dangerous periods of the occupation. The Gestapo had infiltrated several resistance networks, and arrests were happening with terrible frequency. Within weeks of her arrival, most of her network was captured. Noor found herself the last remaining radio link between the resistance in Paris and London. The orders from her superiors were clear: return to England immediately. The situation was too compromised. But if she left, the network would collapse entirely. Allied intelligence would go dark. So she stayed. For 4 months, she moved constantly, never sleeping in the same location twice, transmitting messages from basements and attics and abandoned buildings. She changed her appearance, dyed her hair, wore different clothes, spoke in different accents. She was hunted, and she knew it, but she continued to send messages because the messages mattered. She transmitted details about German defenses along the Atlantic coast, information that would later prove critical for planning the Normandy invasion. She was, in those final months of 1943, one of the most important intelligence assets the Allies had in France. The women of the resistance came from everywhere. They were communists like Marie Claude, Catholics like the young women who hid Jewish children in convents, aristocrats like the Countess Lily Pastor who sheltered artists and intellectuals in her Marseille chateau, working-class mothers who stole German documents from the offices where they cleaned floors, students who distributed underground newspapers at university, farm women who hid parachuted weapons in their barns beneath piles of hay. They came from different politics, different classes, different regions, but they shared a refusal to accept what was happening. They had seen too much: the Jewish families forced to wear yellow stars, the mass arrests, the deportations to camps in the East whose purposes were whispered about but not yet fully understood, the casual brutality of soldiers who treated French civilians as subhuman. They had seen collaboration and greed and cowardice, and they had chosen to be something else. Lucie Aubrac became a symbol of this refusal. She was a history teacher in Lyon, married to a man named Raymond who was a founder of the resistance movement Liberation Sud. In the spring of 1943, Raymond was arrested by the Gestapo, along with Jean Moulin, the legendary resistance leader who was attempting to unify the fractured networks under a single command. Raymond was held at a military prison on the outskirts of the city, awaiting deportation to Germany. Lucie, who was pregnant with their second child, decided to break him out. She spent weeks preparing. She forged documents. She recruited a team of fighters willing to risk their lives for the operation. She visited Raymond in prison, posing as his fiancée, and passed him a coded message explaining the plan. Then, on October 21, 1943, she and her team ambushed the truck transporting Raymond and other prisoners. The attack was swift and chaotic. Guns fired, tires blown out, men shouting in French and German. Raymond and 2 other prisoners were pulled from the wreckage and spirited away while German soldiers scrambled to respond. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes. Lucie gave birth to their daughter 6 weeks later. By then, she and Raymond were in hiding, moving constantly, sleeping in different safe houses every night. The Gestapo was searching for them with the kind of focused rage that came from being humiliated. But Lucie did not stop working. She continued to organize, to coordinate, to plan actions against the occupiers. She had learned that power was not something you asked for. It was something you took, with intelligence and courage and the willingness to risk everything. Daily life under occupation was an exercise in constant negotiation between the ordinary and the catastrophic. You woke up and made breakfast, if you had food, which increasingly you did not, and you listened to the BBC on an illegal radio hidden in the attic, and you sent your children to school with instructions not to talk about what they heard at home. You stood in line for hours to receive your ration coupons, and you smiled at the German soldiers who controlled the checkpoints, and you went home and altered the documents that would save someone's life. You lived 2 lives simultaneously, the visible and the invisible, and you learned to keep them separate in your mind because to confuse them was to die. The hunger was constant. Rations were inadequate and growing worse as the war dragged on and Germany stripped France of resources to feed its own armies. People ate rutabagas and turnips and bread that tasted like sawdust. They ate cats and pigeons. In the cities, children developed rickets and tuberculosis. In the countryside, farmers hid food from the German requisitions and sold it on the black market, where prices were extortionate but at least there was something to buy. Women became experts at improvisation, sewing clothes from old curtains, making soap from wood ash, stretching a single chicken into a week's worth of meals. Resistance work had to be fit around the basic struggle for survival. The fear was also constant, though it took different forms. There was the immediate fear of checkpoints and searches, the possibility that the papers you carried might be detected as forgeries, that the person standing next to you might be an informer. There was the deeper fear of what the Gestapo did to prisoners. Everyone knew someone who had been arrested and tortured. The methods were systematic: beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding, psychological torment. The goal was not just to extract information but to break the will, to turn resistance fighters into collaborators, to demonstrate that opposition was futile. The prisons were places of horror, and the knowledge of what happened there haunted every action. And there was the fear for others, your family, your children, your friends. The Germans practiced collective punishment. If a resistance fighter was discovered, their entire family might be arrested. Villages that sheltered partisans were burned. Hostages were executed in public as warnings. The calculus of resistance included the knowledge that your courage might result in someone else's death. This was perhaps the cruelest burden, the one that kept people awake at night, wondering if they had the right to risk not just their own life but the lives of people they loved. Yet they continued. They continued because stopping meant accepting defeat, and defeat was unthinkable. They continued because every small act of resistance, every forged document, every British pilot guided to safety, every railway line sabotaged, was a crack in the structure of fascism, a reminder that totalitarian power was never as total as it claimed. They continued because they believed, however improbably, that France would be liberated, that the war would end, that justice would eventually prevail. The year 1943 was a turning point. The Germans had lost Stalingrad in February, and the myth of invincibility was shattered. In North Africa, the Allies were advancing. Italy was on the verge of collapse. The war's outcome was no longer certain. But this made the occupation more brutal, not less. The Gestapo intensified their efforts to crush the resistance. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was systematically destroying networks in the southeast. In Paris, agents of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence service of the SS, were infiltrating groups, using captured radios to send false messages to London, turning the resistance's own communication systems against them. The toll was staggering. Hundreds of agents were arrested. Many were executed. Others were deported to concentration camps in Germany and Poland, places whose names would later become synonymous with Industriali's death: Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Buchenwald. Noor Inayat Khan was arrested in October 1943. She had been betrayed, either by an informant or through a captured radio. The exact mechanism was never clear. The Gestapo came for her at an apartment in Paris where she had been transmitting. She tried to escape across the rooftops but was cornered. She actually fought, physically resisting arrest in a way her training had discouraged, and was subdued. They found her codebooks, which she had kept despite orders to destroy them, and her pistol, which she had never learned to fire effectively. She was taken to Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Foch. She refused to cooperate. In interrogations, she gave nothing. They tried everything: isolation, threats, physical abuse, but she would not break. After weeks of this, the Gestapo classified her as highly dangerous and sent her to Germany, to Pforzheim prison, where she was held in chains. She remained there for nearly a year, in solitary confinement, treated with a cruelty usually reserved for violent criminals. In September 1944, as Allied forces were sweeping across France, she and 3 other female SOE agents were transferred to Dachau concentration camp. They were executed immediately upon arrival, shot in the back of the head. Noor's last word, according to a witness, was "Libet." The story of her death would not be known until after the war. Her family waited for her to return. The SOE listed her as missing. It was only during the war crimes trials that testimony emerged about what had happened at Dachau, about the systematic murder of captured agents, about the bureaucratic precision with which the SS had erased people from existence. Noor was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry. But the medal could not address the larger questions about what her death meant, about whether the mission had been worth the price, about how many other women had died in similar obscurity. The arrests continued through the autumn and winter. Andrée de Jongh was finally captured in January 1943, betrayed by a double agent who had infiltrated the Comet Line. She was interrogated for weeks in Paris, then sent to Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women in northern Germany. She survived, one of the few. Her physical resilience and her absolute refusal to reveal anything about her network kept her alive through 2 years of forced labor, starvation, and disease. When the camp was liberated in 1945, she weighed less than 90 pounds. She returned to Belgium and resumed her life as a nurse, speaking rarely about the war. Germaine Tillon, the anthropologist who had documented the resistance, was arrested in August 1943. A member of her network had been captured and tortured into providing names. Germaine was sent to Ravensbrück as well. There, she continued her work of documentation, secretly recording the structure of the camp, the names of prisoners, the details of medical experiments being conducted on women. She created a network within the camp, organizing mutual aid, sharing food, helping others survive. Her scholarly discipline became an act of resistance. She refused to let the SS erase the evidence of their crimes. She survived and would later write about her experience in a book titled Ravensbrück, a testament to the women who did not. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier was arrested in February 1942, earlier than most. She was betrayed by an informant within the communist resistance. The Gestapo interrogated her at the Sandy prison in Paris, then sent her to the fort of Romainville, where political prisoners were held before deportation. In January 1943, she was among a convoy of women sent to Auschwitz. She was tattooed with the number 31,655. She worked in the camp hospital, witnessed the selections, saw the chimneys of the crematoria burning day and night. She survived, barely, through a combination of luck, solidarity with other prisoners, and sheer endurance. After the war, she testified at the Nuremberg trials, one of the first witnesses to describe the reality of the camps to an international audience. Her testimony was meticulous and devastating, delivered in a steady voice that refused to sensationalize but simply told the truth. The thing about the deportations was that people did not understand where they were going. The Nazis used euphemisms, resettlement, labor camps in the East, protective custody. Letters were sometimes sent back, forced correspondence that spoke of work and community and survival. The truth was hidden behind bureaucratic language and barbed wire. Even the resistance, with all its intelligence networks, did not fully grasp the scale of what was happening until late in the war. Individual camps were known. Rumors circulated. But the systematic, industrial nature of the genocide was beyond what people could imagine. It was only later, when the camps were liberated and the evidence became undeniable, that the full horror was revealed. Not all resistance work involved direct confrontation. Much of it was quieter, more patient. Women ran escape lines for Jews, hiding families in attics and cellars, arranging false papers, guiding them to the Swiss or Spanish borders. This work required immense moral courage because the penalties were immediate and brutal. The Nazis had made it clear, anyone caught aiding Jews would be executed. Entire families were destroyed for the crime of compassion. Yet people did it anyway. The village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, in the mountains of south-central France, became a refuge. The population was predominantly Protestant, descendants of Huguenots who had themselves been persecuted for their beliefs centuries earlier. When Jewish refugees began arriving, fleeing the roundups in the cities, the villagers took them in. They hid them in farms and private homes. The local pastor, Andrée de Jongh, and his wife Magda organized the effort, but it was the women of the village who did much of the practical work, finding food, forging documents, teaching refugee children in secret schools, keeping watch for German patrols. Thousands of Jews passed through Le Chambon during the war. The villagers called it la résistance spirituelle, spiritual resistance. They saw it as a moral obligation, not heroism. Years later, when asked why they had done it, they were often baffled by the question, how could they not? In Paris, a network of social workers operated under the cover of a relief organization, placing Jewish children with Catholic families in the countryside. André Salomon and Yvonne Neve-Jean coordinated this effort, working with nuns and priests and ordinary families who agreed to take the risk. The children were given new names, taught to recite Catholic prayers, warned never to speak about their real identities. It was traumatic, being separated from parents, living in constant fear of discovery, learning to suppress your own history. But it saved lives. Hundreds of children survived the war because of this network, though many never saw their parents again. By mid-1943, the pace of resistance activity had accelerated. The Allies were planning for an eventual invasion of France, and they needed intelligence. The SOE and the French resistance worked together to map German defenses, to identify key targets for sabotage, to prepare for the moment when the occupation would be challenged militarily. Women were central to this effort. They photographed military installations, counted trains and trucks, noted troop movements. They passed this information through courier chains that stretched across the country, each link in the chain knowing only the person before and after them, so that if one was captured, the entire network would not collapse. Pearl Witherington was a secretary for the British Air Ministry when the war began. She was fluent in French, having grown up in Paris, and in 1943, the SOE recruited her as a courier. She parachuted into central France and joined a network led by a man named Maurice Southgate. Her job was to carry messages between cells, to coordinate sabotage operations, to maintain communication with London. She did this for months, cycling hundreds of miles through the countryside, memorizing coded instructions, delivering them with perfect accuracy. When Southgate was arrested in May 1944, Pearl took over the network. She commanded more than 1,500 Maquis fighters, the rural guerrilla groups that had formed in the mountains and forests, organizing ambushes, derailing trains, harassing German units as they tried to move north to counter the D-Day invasion. She was recommended for the Military Cross, one of Britain's highest awards for combat valor, but was instead awarded the civilian MBE because women were not technically allowed to serve in combat roles. She sent the medal back, explaining that her work had been combat, and she deserved to be recognized as such. The Maquis were the most visible face of resistance by 1943, though they were often the least organized. They were made up of young men fleeing forced labor conscription, communists committed to armed struggle, Spanish Republicans who had been refugees in France since 1939, deserters from the French army. They hid in the remote areas, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the forests of Brittany, and launched raids on German convoys. They were romanticized after the war, turned into symbols of French defiance. But the reality was messier. The Maquis often lacked weapons, training, discipline. They depended on parachute drops from the Allies for supplies, and those drops were unpredictable. They also depended on the local population for food and shelter, which meant that the civilian population bore the consequences of German reprisals. Women supported the Marquis in countless ways. They cooked for fighters in remote camps. They carried supplies up mountain trails. They served as lookouts and messengers. Some were nurses, treating wounded men in barns and caves, without anesthesia or proper equipment, watching men die from infections because there were no antibiotics. And some were fighters themselves, though this was rarer. The mythology of the resistance was deeply gendered. Men fought, women supported. But the reality was more fluid. Women used weapons. Women killed. It was simply less talked about, both during the war and after. The Atlantic coast was a region of particular strategic importance. The Germans were building the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of fortifications designed to repel an Allied invasion. Concrete bunkers were constructed, minefields laid, gun emplacements installed. Thousands of conscripted labourists, French, Polish, Russian prisoners of war, were forced to build these defences under brutal conditions. The resistance targeted the construction sites, sabotaging equipment, stealing blueprints, passing detailed information about the fortifications to London. This intelligence would prove invaluable when the Allies finally launched the invasion in June 1944. In Brittany, a woman named Jean Bohec worked as a saboteur. She had been trained by the SOE in explosives and demolition. She parachuted into France in early 1944 and spent months teaching local resistance groups how to use plastic explosives, how to set charges on railway lines, how to time detonations to maximize damage. She was precise and unflappable, qualities that earned her the respect of the men she worked with, though some of them were initially skeptical about taking orders from a woman. She proved herself through action. She destroyed bridges, derailed trains, blew up fuel depots. She was injured once when an explosion went off prematurely, leaving her with scars she carried for the rest of her life. The work of radio operators like Noor Inayat Khan was complemented by the work of decoders and analysts, many of whom were women working in London. Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking centre, employed thousands of women who intercepted German communications, decrypted messages, identified patterns in enemy movements. They worked long shifts in cold, windowless rooms, and their contributions were classified for decades after the war. But without them, the intelligence flowing from occupied France would have been useless. The resistance network was not just the people in France taking risks. It was a vast, interconnected system that stretched across Europe and Britain, and women were essential at every level. The winter of 1943-44 was particularly harsh. Fuel was scarce, and heating was almost non-existent. People burned furniture to stay warm. The cold made resistance work harder. Messages took longer to deliver because travel was slower. Parachute drops were less frequent because of the weather. The risk of frostbite on mountain crossings increased. But the work did not stop. If anything, it intensified. There was a sense that the war was approaching a climax, that the invasion everyone spoke of in whispers would come soon, and that preparation was essential. The Germans were increasingly paranoid. Checkpoints became more frequent and more thorough. Random searches were conducted on trains and buses. Gestapo raids on suspected resistance members happened at all hours. The occupiers knew they were losing control, and they responded with escalating violence. In Oradour-sur-Glane, a village in the Limousin region, SS troops massacred the entire population, 642 men, women, and children, in June 1944, in retaliation for partisan activity. The village was burned. Bodies were left in the streets as a warning. The massacre was one of many, though it became the most infamous. The message was clear: resistance would be met with total annihilation. Yet people continued to resist. They continued because the alternative was unbearable. They continued because they believed in something larger than their own survival. They continued because they had seen what fascism did, not as an abstraction, but as a daily reality. They had seen their Jewish neighbors forced onto trains. They had seen their friends arrested for printing newspapers. They had seen men shot for listening to the BBC. They had seen their country occupied, humiliated, exploited. And they had decided that complicity was not an option. The spring of 1944 brought new hope and new danger. The Allies were clearly preparing for an invasion. The BBC broadcast cryptic messages that everyone understood were coded instructions to resistance networks. Les sanglots longs des violins de l'automne, the long sobs of autumn's violins. When the invasion came, The resistance was to launch a coordinated campaign of sabotage, cutting railways, destroying bridges, attacking German supply lines. The planning was meticulous. Every major resistance network had its targets. Every region had its assignments. The coordination was imperfect, communication was difficult, and many groups operated independently, but the overall strategy was sound. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The invasion had begun. The resistance sprang into action. In the weeks that followed, thousands of acts of sabotage disrupted German efforts to reinforce their positions. Railways were blown up, delaying troop movements by days. Telephone lines were cut, isolating German units from their command structure. Convoys were ambushed on rural roads. The German army found itself fighting not just the Allies advancing from the beaches, but an invisible enemy behind their lines. The resistance could not win battles, but they could make every German movement costly and dangerous. Women were everywhere in this campaign. They guided Allied pilots shot down over France to safe zones. They carried messages about German troop concentrations. They hid wounded fighters in their homes. They nursed both resistance members and Allied soldiers, often in the same makeshift hospitals set up in barns and cellars. They watched German convoys and reported numbers and directions. They maintained the communication networks that allowed scattered groups to coordinate. They did all this while still pretending to live ordinary lives, still shopping with ration cards, still sending children to school, still maintaining the fiction that they were uninvolved. Violette Sobo was 23 years old when she parachuted into France in April 1944, 2 months before D-Day. She was Anglo-French, widowed. Her husband, a French foreign legionnaire, had been killed at El Alamein, and she had a young daughter back in England. The SOE had recruited her because of her language skills and her composure under pressure. Her first mission was to assess the readiness of resistance networks in the Limoges area. She completed it successfully and returned to England. Her second mission, in June, was to coordinate sabotage efforts after the invasion. She was captured on June 10th, 4 days after D-Day. Her car had been stopped at a German roadblock near the village of Salon-la-Tour. She tried to escape, firing at German soldiers as she ran through fields. She was hit in the arm but kept moving, kept firing, until her ammunition ran out. The Germans brought her to Gestapo headquarters in Limoges, where she was interrogated by men who already suspected she was an SOE agent. She told them nothing. They beat her, and she told them nothing. They threatened her, and she told them nothing. After weeks of this, they sent her to Paris, to Fresnes prison, and then to Ravensbrück. She died at Ravensbrück in February 1945, 3 months before the camp was liberated. The exact circumstances were documented later by survivors. Violette and 2 other female SOE agents, Denise Bloch and Lillian Rolfe, were executed by shooting. They were made to kneel. The SS officer who carried out the executions testified after the war that all 3 women had maintained their dignity to the end, that they had refused blindfolds, that they had shown no fear. This testimony became part of the official record, part of how their stories were told. But it could not capture what they felt in those final moments, what they thought about, whether they believed their sacrifice had mattered. The liberation of France was chaotic and bloody. As Allied forces advanced, German units retreated, often destroying infrastructure as they went. The Maquis emerged from hiding and fought openly, sometimes liberating towns and villages before American or British troops arrived. In Paris, the resistance staged an uprising in August 1944, building barricades, attacking German positions, taking control of neighborhoods. The fighting lasted for days. The Germans considered burning the city, but the commanding officer, General Dietrich von Koltitz, disobeyed Hitler's orders and negotiated a surrender. General de Gaulle entered the city on August 25th, leading a parade down the Champs-Élysées. The crowd was enormous, ecstatic, weeping with relief. But liberation was not the same everywhere. In the south, in Alsace-Lorraine, fighting continued into the winter. German forces held defensive positions, and the cost of dislodging them was high. The Maquis fought alongside Free French and American units, often serving as guides through terrain they knew intimately. Women were still there, still serving as medics, still carrying supplies, still transmitting messages. The war did not end cleanly, all at once. It ground to a halt in pieces, region by region, village by village. And with liberation came reckoning. The Resistance had maintained lists, people who had collaborated, who had informed to the Gestapo, who had profited from the black market while others starved. In some towns, The settling of accounts was swift and violent. Collaborators were executed without trial. Women who had had relationships with German soldiers, the horizontal collaborators, were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved, paraded through streets while crowds jeered. These acts were understandable in the context of occupation's trauma, but they were also disturbing. They revealed the depth of rage and betrayal that 4 years of occupation had created. They also revealed the limits of resistance solidarity. The women who had fought in the resistance were not the same as the women punished for collaboration, but both groups were judged by their proximity to men, by their bodies, by gendered standards of behavior that persisted even in liberation. The women who returned from concentration camps were often met with silence. What they had endured was beyond what people who had stayed in France could comprehend. The camps had been rumors, distant horrors. Now survivors came back with tattooed numbers on their arms, with bodies wasted by starvation, with stories of medical experiments and gas chambers and crematoria that sounded impossible. Some people did not want to hear. Some did not believe. The survivors themselves often struggled to speak. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you explain systematic dehumanization to people who had experienced occupation but not extermination? Germaine Tillyon returned from Ravensbrück weighing less than 70 pounds. She had kept her ethnographic notes, hidden and passed among prisoners, and she used them to write about the camp with the same analytical precision she had once used to study Algerian tribes. But the writing was also personal, filled with portraits of women who had helped each other survive, who had shared food and warmth and hope when all three were almost non-existent. She believed that bearing witness was a duty, that the world needed to know what had happened, that silence would allow the horror to be forgotten or denied. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier testified at Nuremberg, as mentioned, but she also testified in French courts, in German courts, whenever there were trials of war criminals. She spoke about what she had seen at Auschwitz, the arrival of transports, the selections on the platform, the women and children sent directly to the gas chambers. She spoke in a flat, factual tone, without emotion, because emotion might have made her seem unreliable. But the facts were devastating enough. The judges and prosecutors listened in silence. Some wept. The transcripts of her testimony were published and became part of the historical record, evidence that could not be disputed. Andrée de Jongh returned to Belgium and tried to resume her life. She worked as a nurse in a leprosarium in Ethiopia for many years, far from Europe, far from the war. She rarely spoke about the Comet Line or Ravensbrück. When historians sought her out, she was polite but reticent. She did not think of herself as a hero. She had done what was necessary, and she had survived when many others had not. That survival carried its own burden, guilt that she was alive when so many were dead, when Didi the legend had become more real than Andrée the woman. The recognition of women's roles in the resistance came slowly and incompletely. After the war, France needed heroes, needed a narrative of national redemption. General de Gaulle promoted the idea of La France Resistant, a France that had never really accepted defeat, that had fought from the beginning. This narrative was politically useful but historically simplistic. It minimized collaboration, exaggerated resistance, and gendered the story in predictable ways. Men were the fighters, the leaders, the architects of liberation. Women were helpers, supporters, occasionally brave but fundamentally secondary. This narrative was reflected in the awards and honors distributed after the war. Men received military decorations, public positions, pensions. Women received less. The Croix de Guerre, the French military honor for bravery, was awarded to thousands of men but far fewer women, even when their actions were comparable. The SOE women who had died were honored by Britain, but often their families did not receive full military pensions because the women had been technically civilians. The assumption that women's contributions were less valuable, less central, shaped how the resistance was remembered. But the women who had lived through it knew better. They knew that the networks had depended on female couriers, that safe houses had been maintained by women, that intelligence had been gathered and transmitted by women, that Jews had been hidden by women, that the logistics of resistance, the daily, unglamorous work of keeping people alive and operations running, had largely been done by women. They knew this because they had lived it. But they also understood that challenging the dominant narrative was difficult. The post-war years were about rebuilding, about moving forward, not about relitigating who deserved credit. Some women wrote memoirs. Lucie Aubrac published her account of the resistance and her husband's rescue. It was vivid and compelling, though later historians would question some details, argue that she had dramatized certain events. The debate over her memoir became a proxy for larger arguments about memory and history, about how we balance personal testimony with documentary evidence, about whether survivor stories should be treated as sacred or subjected to critical analysis. Lucie herself was frustrated by the controversy. She had lived through the events. She had risked her life. And now, decades later, academics were questioning whether she had remembered everything correctly. Pearl Witherington never wrote a book. She gave occasional interviews, spoke at commemorations, but mostly lived quietly with her husband, Maurice Corneille, one of the resistance fighters she had worked with during the war. She kept her SOE uniform in a closet and her medals in a drawer. When people asked her about the war, she was matter-of-fact. She had done a job. It had been dangerous, yes, but many people had done dangerous things. Why should she be singled out? This modesty was common among the women of the resistance. They did not see themselves as exceptional. They had responded to extraordinary circumstances with whatever skills and courage they possessed. They had been terrified most of the time. They had made mistakes. They had been lucky. To be treated as heroes felt strange, even false, because heroism implied a kind of fearlessness they had never felt. What they had felt was fear and determination existing simultaneously, fear and duty, fear and love for a country that was being destroyed. The historical record of the resistance is vast but incomplete. Many documents were destroyed during the war, burned to prevent discovery, lost in the chaos of liberation. Many resistance members died without leaving written accounts. The oral histories that were collected, often decades later, are invaluable but also shaped by time and memory. People forget. They conflate events. They emphasize certain aspects and downplay others. This is not dishonesty. It is the nature of memory. What we know for certain is that women were everywhere in the resistance. They were in every network, every region, every type of activity. They were not auxiliary. They were essential. And they paid the same prices men paid: arrest, torture, deportation, execution. Of the approximately 90,000 French people deported to concentration camps for political reasons during the war, thousands were women. At Ravensbrück alone, which was specifically a women's camp, thousands of French women died. The exact numbers are difficult to determine because the Nazis destroyed records, because many women were sent to other camps like Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, because the chaos of the war's end meant that many deaths went unrecorded. The women who survived carried the war with them for the rest of their lives. They carried it in nightmares, in sudden panics triggered by sounds or smells, in the inability to talk about what they had endured. They carried it in their relationships, in the distance they sometimes felt from people who had not experienced occupation, in the knowledge that they had killed or watched people die and that this knowledge could not be shared. They carried it in their bodies, the chronic illnesses that resulted from starvation and abuse, the infertility caused by medical experiments or malnutrition, the scars. But they also carried pride. They had resisted. They had not accepted the occupation passively. They had fought, in their own ways, with whatever tools they had. They had maintained their humanity in conditions designed to destroy it. They had proven that ordinary people, women working as teachers and nurses and mothers, could stand against totalitarianism and survive. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, everything. The 50th anniversary of the liberation, in 1994, brought renewed attention to the resistance. Veterans were aging, dying. There was a sense of urgency about recording their stories before they were lost. Oral history. Projects proliferated. Museums created exhibits. Schools taught about the resistance in more detail. And slowly, the role of women began to be more fully acknowledged. Books were written specifically about female resistance members. Documentaries featured their testimonies. Memorials included their names alongside men's. But even this recognition was partial. The women who were remembered tended to be those who fit certain narratives: SOE agents with dramatic stories, famous names like Lucie Aubrac, women whose actions could be easily categorized and celebrated. The countless others, the anonymous couriers, the safehouse operators, the women who hid children and forged documents and carried messages, remained largely invisible. They had no medals, no memoirs, no historical plaques. They had simply done what needed to be done and then returned to their lives, if they survived. One such woman was known only as Denise to her network. Her real name was never recorded, or if it was, the records did not survive. She operated in Normandy in 1943 and 1944, running a safehouse for downed Allied airmen. She sheltered dozens of men, fed them with rations she could barely spare, arranged their passage to escape lines. She was never arrested. She survived the war. And then she disappeared from history. We know she existed because other people mention her in testimonies. Denise saved my life, one pilot wrote, but we know nothing else about her. Not her full name, not her fate after the war, not whether she was ever recognized for what she did. Denise represents thousands of women whose contributions were real and vital but unrecorded. The historical archive privileges certain kinds of evidence, documents, official records, testimonies from people who survived to tell their stories. It marginalizes experiences that left no paper trail, that were too dangerous to document at the time, that belonged to people who did not survive or who chose not to speak. This is the tragedy of history, not that it lies, but that it forgets. The France that emerged from the war was different from the France that had fallen in 1940. It was scarred, divided, haunted by collaboration and defeat. But it was also renewed by the memory of resistance, by the knowledge that thousands of people had refused to accept occupation. This memory became central to French national identity, sometimes in ways that were mythological rather than historical. The resistance was romanticized, turned into a story of universal French defiance, when the reality had been messier: widespread collaboration, passive acceptance, opportunism alongside heroism. Women's place in post-war France was also contested. The resistance had temporarily disrupted gender roles. Women had fought, led, killed. They had proven themselves capable of anything men could do. But the post-war order sought to restore traditional structures. Women gained the right to vote in 1944. France was surprisingly late to women's suffrage, but many of the women who had been resistance fighters found themselves pushed back into domestic roles. The skills they had developed, leadership, strategic thinking, courage under pressure, were not valued in civilian life. They were expected to return to being wives and mothers, to make their wartime activities a footnote rather than a defining experience. Some resisted this as well. They entered politics, though the number of women in government remained small. They wrote, they taught, they kept networks alive through veterans associations. They insisted that their stories mattered, that the resistance had not been exclusively male, that the history needed to be corrected. But it was exhausting, arguing against entrenched narratives, fighting to be remembered when the culture wanted to forget or simplify. Lise de Baissac, the SOE agent who had organized sabotage networks in Poitiers, never spoke publicly about her wartime activities. She married after the war and lived in France, in Marseille, working as a decorative arts dealer. She attended some SOE reunions but was otherwise private. When historians tried to interview her decades later, she was reluctant. She had moved on. The war was in the past. What use was there in dwelling on it? Her reticence meant that much of what she did remained undocumented, known only through the report she had filed with the SOE during the war, dry summaries of operations that conveyed none of the fear or complexity or human cost. Virginia Hall was an American who had worked for the SOE and later the OSS, the American intelligence service that would become the CIA. She had a prosthetic leg, the result of a hunting accident before the war, and she walked with a limp that she disguised carefully. She had operated in Lyon and later in central France, organizing resistance groups, coordinating parachute drops, evading the Gestapo despite being one of their most wanted agents. After the war, she joined the CIA and worked in intelligence for decades, one of the few women to achieve a senior position in the agency. But her wartime exploits were classified, and she never spoke about them publicly. She died in 1982, her story known only to a small circle of colleagues and historians. The question of how to remember the resistance, and specifically how to remember women's roles in it, remains unresolved. Every generation approaches the history differently, brings different questions, seeks different meanings. For some, the resistance is a story of heroism and national redemption. For others, it is a more complicated narrative about moral choices under extreme circumstances, about collaboration and complicity, about who gets remembered and why. The women who died in the resistance, shot, gassed, worked to death in camps, left ghosts. They haunt the landscapes where they operated. The streets of Paris where couriers once carried messages. The mountain passes where guides led fugitives to safety. The villages where safe houses sheltered the hunted. The prisons where they were tortured. The camps where they died. These places are marked now, sometimes, with plaques and memorials. But the markers are inadequate. They give names and dates but cannot convey the fullness of lived experience, the texture of fear and hope, the mundane details of resistance work, the cold coffee in the cafe, the weight of documents hidden in clothes, the sound of footsteps behind you on a dark street. In 1993, a memorial was unveiled at Ravensbrück to honor the women who had died there. It was a long time coming, nearly 50 years after the camp's liberation. The memorial is stark, modernist, a sculpture of a woman carrying another woman. It stands near where the crematoria once operated. Survivors attended the dedication ceremony. They were old by then, in their 70s and 80s, women who had been young when they were arrested, when they had been sent to a camp whose purpose was to extract labor and then dispose of those who could no longer work. They stood in the cold and remembered friends who had not survived, remembered sharing food and warmth and hope when all three were scarce, remembered the solidarity that had kept some of them alive. One survivor, a French woman named Agnès Postelvini, spoke at the ceremony. She had been arrested for resistance activities in 1942 and sent to Ravensbrück. She survived, barely, and spent the rest of her life working to ensure that the camp was remembered, that the women who died there were not forgotten. At the memorial dedication, she said something that has been quoted often since: "We were ordinary women who did what we had to do. We do not want to be called heroes. We want to be remembered." This distinction, between heroism and remembrance, is important. To call someone a hero is to place them on a pedestal, to suggest that their actions were exceptional, beyond what normal people are capable of. But the women of the resistance were normal people. They were afraid. They made mistakes. They sometimes failed. What made them extraordinary was not that they were fearless, but that they acted despite their fear. They chose resistance when collaboration or passivity would have been easier and safer. They chose it knowing the risks, knowing that they might die, knowing that their families might suffer because of their choices. This is what makes their stories important. Not because they were superhuman, but because they were human. Because they prove that ordinary people, when confronted with injustice, can choose to resist. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. That one person carrying a message, hiding a fugitive, sharing information, can make a difference. That totalitarian power, despite all its violence and control, is never total. There are always cracks, always spaces for resistance, always people willing to take risks. The testimonies of survivors are painful to read. They describe things that are almost unbearable: the death of friends, the degradation of imprisonment, the constant hunger and cold and fear. But they also describe moments of beauty and connection. A prisoner sharing her last piece of bread with someone weaker. Women singing together in barracks at night. Acts of defiance so small they might seem meaningless. Refusing to salute an SS guard, stealing an extra potato, keeping a scrap of paper with a poem written on it. These small acts were assertions of humanity, refusals to be reduced to numbers and labor, insistences that even in hell, dignity was possible. After the war, many survivors struggled with what would later be called PTSD, though the term did not exist then. They had nightmares, flashbacks, difficulty trusting people, difficulty forming relationships. Some self-medicated with alcohol. Some withdrew from society. Some threw themselves into work, into activism, into anything that would keep them from thinking too much about what they had endured. The psychological toll of resistance and imprisonment was profound and lifelong. But many also found ways to build meaningful lives. They married, had children, pursued careers. They found joy in small things: a meal shared with friends, a walk in the countryside, the freedom to move without papers, to speak without fear. They appreciated these things in ways that people who had not lived through occupation could not. They knew how fragile freedom was, how quickly it could be lost, how much it depended on people willing to defend it. The younger generations, born after the war, sometimes struggled to understand. How could their mothers or grandmothers have done these things? How had they found the courage? The survivors often did not have good answers. They had done what seemed necessary at the time. They had not thought of themselves as brave. They had simply reacted to circumstances, made choices that seemed obvious even though they were dangerous. The courage had come from the moment, from the presence of others who were also resisting, from the belief that inaction was worse than risk. In schools, children learned about the resistance in history classes. They learned about Jean Moulin and Charles de Gaulle and the famous acts of sabotage. Sometimes they learned about the female SOE agents, about Lucie Aubrac's dramatic rescue of her husband. But the curriculum rarely conveyed the complexity, the moral ambiguity, the countless small acts that constituted resistance. It was easier to teach about heroes than about the ordinary people who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. The last of the resistance generation is dying now. The youngest members would be in their 90s, the oldest gone. Soon there will be no living witnesses, no one who can say, "I was there, this is what happened, this is what it felt like." The transition from living memory to history is always difficult. Stories become fixed, simplified. The emotional texture fades. The past becomes a series of facts and dates rather than lived experience. This is why testimony matters. Why survivors spent their final years giving interviews, writing memoirs, speaking to students. They understood that memory is fragile, that history is contested, that without witnesses, truth can be denied or distorted. They had seen Holocaust deniers claim that the camps were exaggerated, that the genocide had not happened. They knew that similar lies could be told about resistance, about collaboration, about the choices people made under occupation. So they spoke, even when it was painful, even when they would have preferred silence. One survivor, speaking to a group of students in the 1990s, was asked what she wanted young people to know. She thought for a long time. Then she said, "I want you to know that it can happen again. That fascism is not something from the past. That you will face choices, maybe not as dramatic as ours, but choices nonetheless. And I want you to know that you can resist. That you have more power than you think. That one person can make a difference." This was the essential message. Not that the resistance had been glorious or romantic, but that it had been necessary. That when faced with injustice, people had options. That silence and complicity were choices, just as resistance was a choice. That history was made by individuals deciding, in specific moments, what they were willing to do and what they refused to accept. The landscape of France is still marked by the war. You can find bunkers on beaches, monuments in town squares, plaques on buildings where people were arrested or killed. You can visit museums dedicated to the resistance, see the radio transmitters and forged documents and photographs of people who did not survive. You can walk the streets of Paris and imagine what it was like under occupation, the swastika flags, the German soldiers, the fear that permeated everything. But what you cannot find, in most cases, are traces of the individual women who carried messages through those streets, who hid fugitives in those buildings, who watched from those windows for Gestapo patrols. Their presence has faded. The buildings have been repainted, repurposed. The people who knew them have died. The memory has become generalized, abstracted. The resistance as a concept has replaced the specific, granular reality of individual acts of courage. Historians work to recover these stories. They dig through archives, interview survivors while they still can, piece together networks from fragmentary evidence. They publish books and articles that add nuance to the historical record. But there are limits to what can be recovered. Too much was lost. Too many people died without leaving records. Too many stories were never told because the women who lived them did not think their experiences were important, or because they were too painful to recount, or because no one asked. What remains is a partial picture, inevitably incomplete. We know some names, some stories, some networks. We know that women were central to resistance. We know that they faced the same dangers as men and often additional ones: sexual violence, pregnancy, and motherhood under impossible conditions, the gendered expectations that made their activities more suspect. We know that many were not recognized after the war, that their contributions were minimized or erased. We know that the historical memory of the resistance has been predominantly male, despite the reality being more complex. We also know that the women who participated changed the possibilities for future generations. They proved that women could lead, fight, make strategic decisions under pressure. They challenged the assumption that war and resistance were male domains. They opened space, however small, for women to be seen as full agents in history rather than passive victims or supporters. This legacy is real, even if it has not been fully acknowledged. The war ended in Europe in May 1945. The camps were liberated. Prisoners returned home, many of them so changed by their experiences that they barely recognized themselves. France celebrated, mourned, began the long process of reconstruction. The resistance was officially recognized. De Gaulle spoke of La France libre, the free France that had never accepted defeat. Medals were distributed. Parades were held. But for many of the women who had resisted, the end of the war was not simple triumph. It was complicated by grief for those who had died, by survivors' guilt, by the difficulty of readjusting to civilian life, by the realization that the world they had fought for was not going to be as just or equal as they had hoped. The patriarchy had not been defeated along with fascism. Women's rights were still limited. Their wartime contributions did not translate into post-war power. Some women continued to fight, in different ways. They joined feminist movements, labor unions, peace organizations. They used the skills they had developed in resistance, organizing, strategizing, communicating, to advocate for social change. They understood that liberation was not a single event but an ongoing process, that injustice took many forms, that vigilance was constant. Others withdrew, exhausted by years of danger and loss. They wanted quiet lives, normalcy, the chance to raise children without fear. They had earned that rest. They had given enough. No one had the right to ask more of them. But even in withdrawal, they carried the war with them. It shaped how they saw the world, how they raised their children, what they believed about courage and sacrifice and the fragility of civilization. The children of resistance fighters often felt the weight of their parents' experiences without fully understanding them. Their mothers might wake from nightmares, might flinch at sudden noises, might have strange reactions to innocuous situations. The children learned not to ask too many questions, sensing that certain topics were off-limits. Sometimes they felt resentful, feeling that the war had claimed their parents even though it was over. Sometimes they felt proud, knowing that their mothers had done extraordinary things. Often they felt both simultaneously. As the decades passed, French society's relationship to the resistance evolved. In the immediate post-war years, there was a desire to emphasize resistance and minimize collaboration, to create a narrative of national unity against occupation. This was psychologically necessary but historically dishonest. Collaboration had been widespread. Many French people had accepted or even supported the Vichy regime. The roundup of Jews had been carried out by French police as well as Germans. The full reckoning with this complicity would take decades. By the 1970s, historians were beginning to write more critically about the occupation, examining collaboration as well as resistance, questioning the myths that had been constructed. Films like The Sorrow and the Pity challenged the comfortable narrative of universal resistance. This caused controversy. Veterans felt betrayed. The public was unsettled by the suggestion that France's wartime behavior had been less heroic than they had been taught. But the historical truth was more complex than myth, and complexity needed to be acknowledged. Within this broader reassessment, women's roles began to be examined more carefully. Feminist historians asked why women's contributions had been marginalized, what this revealed about how history was constructed, who got to tell stories and whose stories were considered worth telling. They recovered names and testimonies. They wrote biographies of forgotten resistance fighters. They organized conferences and exhibitions. Slowly, the picture became fuller, more accurate. But even now, in the 21st century, the process is incomplete. There are still women whose stories have not been told, whose names are not known, whose contributions have been forgotten. There are still archives that have not been fully explored, testimonies that have not been recorded, connections that have not been made. The history of the resistance, and particularly the history of women in the resistance, remains a work in progress. What we can say with certainty is this: in France, during the Second World War, under a brutal occupation that sought to crush all opposition, thousands of women resisted. They resisted in ways large and small, dramatic and mundane, public and invisible. They carried messages and sheltered fugitives and transmitted intelligence and nursed the wounded and sabotaged infrastructure and forged documents and led escape networks and endured torture and died in camps. They did this while cooking and cleaning and caring for children, while pretending to be ordinary women living ordinary lives. They did this knowing the risks, knowing that discovery meant almost certain death. They were not all brave in the same way. Some acted from political conviction, others from personal loyalty, still others from a moral sense that resistance was simply the right thing to do. Some were reckless, others cautious. Some were effective, others less so. They made mistakes. They had bad days, moments of doubt, times when they wanted to quit. But they continued. Their legacy is not just in the specific operations they carried out or the intelligence they gathered or the lives they saved, though all of that mattered immensely. Their legacy is in the proof they offered that ordinary people, when confronted with extraordinary evil, can choose to resist. That power is never absolute. That there is always agency, always choice, always the possibility of refusal. This is what needs to be remembered. Not just the names, though the names matter, but the principle. That resistance is possible. That it is necessary. That it costs, sometimes everything, but that the cost of not resisting is higher. That history is made by people deciding, in specific moments, what they will accept and what they will fight against. The women of the French resistance understood this. They lived it. And in living it, they changed what was possible, for themselves and for those who came after. History remembers generals and flags. It remembers speeches and treaties and the movements of armies across maps. It builds monuments to the obvious heroes, the ones whose names everyone knows, whose deeds were public and documented. But somewhere beneath their shadows, in the narrow space between the recorded and the forgotten, there was a woman, perhaps many women, who carried a message that changed the world, who hid a fugitive who would later help win the war, who transmitted intelligence that saved hundreds of lives, who refused to betray her comrades even under torture, who walked over mountains in winter guiding men to freedom, who forged a document that let a child escape the camps, who kept a network functioning when everyone else had been arrested, who survived, or did not survive, and whose name no one ever learned. She existed. She mattered. Her courage was real. And if we cannot remember her name, we can at least remember that she was there.